jobs have never been very stable for me. I think the longest job I've ever held was a year, and on average it was about 4 to 6 months before I either got burned out, sunk into like horrible anxiety, depression, and was not able to mask anymore and would quit, or I'd get fired. I was always jumping from one thing to the other, which is great because it's built a lot of experience, but also it's like it's not very stable, right? The decision I had was that I either risk like falling into like a position where like I have to find supplemental income, or continue down this path and have it be worse than what the risk was. It was kind of like a leap of faith, and I think taking it was one of the best things I've ever done.
Hello and welcome to Working to Work, a neurodivergent journey through employment. This is episode 8, and if you've not listened before, Working to Work explores employment through a neurodivergent lens. So I'm looking at the challenges of obtaining and maintaining work, thinking about the strengths of neurodivergent people and how they can potentially be better recognized, and the impact of having employment, not having employment, and how to make work more accessible and make the world of employment more equitable, and also how people potentially can find work and create work that better aligns with their strengths and their passion. I've got this far without introducing myself. I'm Sam. I'm the host of Working to Work. And in this episode, I spoke with Dani Noreen, who goes by the name the Punk Rock Autistic, in the advocacy work that they do online. They write a blog which goes by the name the Punk Rock Autistic, and also you have this profile on Facebook that many find very relatable and helpful, as attested to the amount of followers they have, which is in the tens of thousands. So there's many people that are appreciative and resonate with what Dani speaks about on these platforms. But Dani also works as a coach and in other avenues of advocacy and support for neurodivergent people outside of the online world. So in this episode, I wanted to understand Dani's prior pre-employment experiences and how they moved to creating their own business effectively and designing a work life that lent to their strengths and passions. We spoke about how Dani realized where their passions and strengths were, how their past experiences, including challenges, were harnessed to do the work that they do now most effectively. We also spoke about the benefits of being open with others about one's capacity and also support needs. We talked about working through self-doubt, which I think when starting one's own initiative is something that can be quite present and can't really be avoided. It has to be moved through. And I think the way Dani speaks honestly about that reality and how they move through it is really interesting and inspiring in some respects. We also spoke about, from Dani's perspective, as someone that works with institutions, works with organizations, works with parents, and works with employers, what employers can meaningfully do to support neurodivergent people in the workplace. So that's this episode. I want to caveat this one by saying, when we recorded this episode, I didn't feel in the most kind of settled place within myself. I think to some extent, maybe through editing, that's not as apparent. It potentially is apparent by how messy my appearance and hair is. I kind of got the timings wrong for this, so I was in a bit of a rush. I think my central point here is that that kind of unsettledness that I felt, and that my internal conditions weren't right in the moment of the interview, got me thinking about the process of producing this, and also what Dani speaks about, I think, in this interview, in some respects, about being open about how one is feeling in that moment and asking for what you need, and also being okay with accepting the offer of time or a delay, which in this case was offered. So I guess in part I mentioned this to caveat what I feel is me not being able to show up in the way I want for myself and for the project, but also as kind of a learning of sorts from this episode. And maybe I'll try and offer that in future for more of these episodes, because each one that I do, it is an iterative learning process. And I kind of want to share that with you as well. The interview went very long. So we recorded for 4 hours, and there's a lot of really interesting discussion, I think, within those 4 hours. So I do plan to release a slightly edited version, but release the kind of the full interview for those that might be interested in Dani's and perhaps my thoughts on areas outside of employment. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I would encourage you, if you're so inclined, to subscribe and to share it with others and to like it and to share any comments you have if you're watching on YouTube, or write me if you're listening on Resonance or the podcast at w2w, that's 2, the number, at kalou, kalou.co.uk. All right, let's get to the interview. I started by asking Dani to speak to the evolution from the Punk Rock Autistic and what that was to Neurodiversity Unbound, which is their business. Here's Dani.
The Punk Rock Autistic started about nearly 3 years ago now, as kind of a point of expression online for me to share my experiences through advocacy and giving, I guess, kind of a sense of like social validation for other neurodivergent folks who are autistic, but also a place for people to find education on the autistic experience. And so my inspiration was to not only talk about like the celebrations of being autistic, but also like the realities and the hardships that we face. And for me, it was by doing it from my own subjective experiences. And I think that drew a lot of people into following it, because the punk rock ethos has always been really important to me, being transparent, being raw, not really following the trends that I was seeing a lot, but being like as authentically myself as possible. And I think it grew a lot because it became this synergetic relationship on social media. It started on Facebook and I still operate that and run it every single day. And that became like my online persona. But it was more just me. It was really, I've always found it really therapeutic to have just a space to vent about things I was dealing with. Right. And I just happened to turn to the internet for that, and it drew a relatively large following. And I found that it developed kind of this synergetic relationship with people where I would talk about my experiences of losing a job or not being able to maintain employment or navigating healthcare, or like my chronic illness and chronic pain experience, or navigating through an ableist lack of accommodation society, and then the things I would achieve that I found success in. And people would be like, oh, I'm not alone. I'm seeing someone else talk about these exact same experiences, but putting into words that I haven't been able to before. Prior to doing the work I was doing now, I've done a lot of stuff in the disability field, and I was a case manager and a social worker for a while. And I wanted to eventually kind of include that into what I was doing. So I started taking on clients as a personal consultant, offering mentorship, education, helping folks like kind of navigate like new diagnosis, or like family members who are autistic, or advocating for like and offering wraparound social supports for folks. And eventually that grew. And then what I decided to do is that I had this online base and foundation that I had built, and then this business that I was growing on the side. And I found that like what you had mentioned with like what's called Neurodiversity Unbound is like a business, and they're the same entity, but they're kind of like I'm at the top here and they're just two sides of the same coin, right?
In Neurodiversity Unbound, what are the different elements of that work?
It's an idea of like encompassing different forms of education advocacy work for different avenues. So um, I work with families, with a couple of clients who are like little kids who are, their parents are frustrated with the system and are not, getting pathologized or being asked to put their kids in ABA or some other problematic kind of program, and they're like, this isn't right. And then they discover like, the autistic advocacy community, and they found me, and like having that firsthand perspective, but also my my knowledge of like my past education, or the work that I've done with case management and more of the psych based stuff of offering kind of counseling, but not counseling, consulting, mentorship, coaching, and even like advocate work. Like I've sat in with like IEP meetings with like families to advocate for that what they're doing, needs to change. Right now, I'm working with the University of Oklahoma as their lead disabled research consultant, creating a dynamic of accessibility through the survey for autistic adults rather than focusing on autistic kids, because that's where most of the focus is. And they hired me and a couple of community advocates to be their consultant, make sure that what they're doing is, not ableist and accessible and represents the autistic community accurately. And then work with some community local nonprofits of creating, education, accessibility, and the accommodations in the workplace for disabled people. So kind of a little bit, but the end goal is I want to kind of create as a coalition, and I want to have other people doing similar work that I'm doing under the same banner in the same environment. Kind of like if you think of like psychology today, you go and you find like a different therapist or counselor that works for you and what your needs are. Similar idea, but having a bunch of different people who are all autistic, all neurodivergent, who work in different fields to create like a platform, coalition that we can address different environments and needs for people internationally. So other like consultants, would like other therapists or community advocates or peer support specialists could to have that element. And then I write a lot, so put those things up there too.
Yeah, your writing's brilliant. I've read everything that you've sent me, and I've really enjoyed it. I guess one thing, all the different aspects of what you're doing now sound like a lot, and they're quite varied. Which how do you feel about the variety of work that you're doing? Like, how is that shifting between the different tasks, and how do you go about practically managing your time to kind of shift gears in all these different ways?
I struggle. I fail. It's hard. It's hard as hell. I get a lot of support from the people in my personal life to help me out. I am terrible at managing emails. My ADHD kicks in, and I will forget things exist. I will forget tasks exist, and I do a lot of apologizing and a lot of making up like for lost time. It's probably the biggest challenge with what I do is managing that variety. It's kind of one of the reasons why in the future I'd like to have other people doing other tasks and other things, is to kind of not have like a hierarchy, but like a sense of like community delegation of tasks for what people might be better suited with.
When you said it, I didn't think of a hierarchy. More, I thought there might be someone that's very interested in this type of work who loves organizing and scheduling and kind of managing what we might think of more as administrative tasks, and that's where their strengths are and joy. It doesn't necessarily need to be a hierarchical thing at all. It's just like what people working where their strengths lie. So I totally understand that, and freeing you up to do kind of what you're best at, what you feel most passionate about, and where your strengths lie.
Exactly. Right now, I've got a friend or two that help me out, like to body double at times when I have terrible executive dysfunction. So they'll be, and being chronically ill, there'll be days at a time where like it's actually the reason why I stopped working a regular job was because of these issues. Just because I started my own business doesn't mean that these issues don't exist. I don't make a lot of money. I things fluctuate all the time, and that's fine. It's barely into this, and I'm doing it on my own, so I have to give myself a little bit of credit. But the support of those in my life have been really beneficial to help when I'm struggling to manage that. But I think what's been really important is kind of what I talked about with you earlier, is that like I've been really fortunate. The people I work with have all been really understanding, and I try to like give them a heads up. Like, you're hiring a disabled person to advocate for disabilities. You got to give people who are disabled the benefit of doubt and let them be disabled. And my side of that is that I would never force people to put neurotypical expectations and able body expectations on others, because I wouldn't want to place on me. And I've been really fortunate and privileged that just about everybody I've worked with has been tremendously understanding of that. So that's been really helpful. The other side of that of managing all of those differences is that I've tried to kind of allow myself to be authentic and unmasked and disabled with that. So it's been a lot of like, something might fall behind. Like, I haven't written anything in almost a year. And that was like where all this started. I post a lot on social media, but I mean, like actual articles, research, blogs, stuff like that. I haven't posted anything in a year. I haven't written anything in a year because the dopamine hasn't been there. The desire, like I want to, but like the energy to actually sit down and do it hasn't existed. So I move that energy elsewhere to focus on something else. And when that falls, I go to something else. So allowing myself the ability to be vulnerable of following that trajectory when it's there is been really helpful.
Yeah, and you've created the kind of work world the way you can move between those different things as your energy takes you. And I think that's whereas in a kind of more conventional job where this is your job, kind of if you are not feeling in the zone to do it, well, you have to do it because this is the job. I think that's really impressive that you've done, and I kind of want to give more like concrete examples whenever possible on this podcast. And I'm thinking about your and I interaction. You mentioned to me, because we were communicating through email, and actually mentioned text is actually easier for me to keep track of. And then since then, I've been texting Dani to coordinate about this. And I think that kind of awareness of like actually really what helps me, and being willing to communicate. A majority of people will be happy to kind of do whatever works.
Yeah, I've got clients who like can't do like video chat because being in front of a video makes them really uncomfortable. So we do over the phone. I have others who don't do email, and the best way to communicate is like through Facebook. So we become friends with Facebook and we just navigate through Messenger. That's been really helpful. Like I think that's really important, like to not only like create accommodations for other people, but also create them for yourself, right? Because it goes both ways. And I'm awful at getting back to people because I forget they exist sometimes, and it's not like intentional. It's how my brain works. And I think being communicative about what those needs and accommodations are, like not only for myself but also for my clients, and making sure that they're getting that. I think kind of makes it not only easier to communicate, but also make sure that like no one's feelings get hurt, you know? So yeah, it's tricky, but it's also easier because most of the people I work with are like not neurotypical. So they all get it.
Have you noticed with the people that you work with that there's been challenges for them in terms of obtaining and maintaining work?
Every single person I work with has a challenge with that. If they are like of the age where they go into working, it's one of the biggest constants that I see. I think it extends past like the work that I do. I think most of my friends who are neurodivergent have similar experiences. I think there's a level of dynamic of difference of that. Some people can find the environments that work for them rather than them working for the environment that they can thrive in. But then there's other people, such as myself, where that environment doesn't seem to exist.
What impact does that have on their lives?
I would say it's the same impact it's had on my life. Is that not only is it made navigating socioeconomic difficulties like really challenging. That's a whole other conversation, especially with like the lack of accessibility to social services for people who are disabled. Most of them end up living in some level of poverty, and navigating that is really challenging. But then there's also the mental health factor of it that I think is probably the biggest consistency that I see. And it's something that I would say is my experiences as well, is there's this tremendous level of guilt that I think each of us kind of experience, that is born from this like idea of like expectations and social demands of like what it means to, be a functioning member of society. And when you fall out of that line and you fall in that crack, it it can really mess somebody up. And I think the hardest part of that is that there's this idea that all of us, I think, experience of this like, oh, you're not trying hard enough, or you're not working hard enough, or it's so easy, everybody else does it, why can't you? um, can create some tremendously challenging mental health situations for people. um, and it's really hard to get out of that, um, because it's trauma, right? And I think it becomes this kind of continuous loop for people, that even if they do find like an element of success in their life, it's never really enough, because you know they're, oh, you're not working a regular job, you're circumnavigating the system to support yourself some other way, like it's not enough money, what are your like future goals, how are you going to retire, how are you going to like all of these like elements, right, that are placed on us. And it's just like, man, I'm just trying to survive day by day. Like I didn't make it in that world, I can't, that world's not accessible for us, so I'm trying to do my own thing. And it's almost like this element, it's like, doesn't matter what you do, it's never really going to feel good enough. Where um, I think that's a factor that a lot of us face. I think that's probably the most common thing I see with people who are navigating employment and the difficulties that come with it.
We touched on that a bit, and really what I'm curious about is, what are the things that make you good at what you do?
I think a lot of it is my willingness to be vulnerable in the public kind of awareness, um, raw, transparent. A lot of disability advocacy, usually outside of those with the lived experience, um, will talk about things from a very medical and pathologizing perspective. They'll write essays on it, and then they'll do documentaries on it, but they always exclude the experience of that person that they're talking about, right? It's always like it creates this person of being like an other or an item that they're describing. It's an object. And for me, it's like, you want to know about those experiences, I'll tell you. I'll write it all out. I'll put a picture. I'll full send it, right? Like, and I think that a lot of people will see that and be like, there's so much more humanity in that. That is a real person experiencing this thing. It destigmatizes it, and that's a big intention for me. And then when it comes to my work, that's a huge similarity in philosophy of like why I might be a little bit different. I went through a lot of trauma as a kid, and it's not necessarily because of my parents. I had a pretty good relationship with my family. I think that they were also victim of circumstances of systematic approaches that probably weren't the best for me or best for the family. And they bought into it and they believed it. They don't anymore, but it was the 90s. It was what was available. And because of that, there were a lot of experiences that were really challenging. And as a kid, I remember saying to myself, I don't ever want this to make me jaded. I don't want to lose my empathy, my compassion for other people. I want this to. It was always kind of this like glimmer of hope that I held on to. It's like, one day this is going to be worth something. And then it got to the point where I'm like, 3 years ago, I quit my job and I decided I don't want to do this anymore. This isn't working for me. I'm not going to make it in life, existing, being alive anymore, if I continue to navigate down this way that I've been doing. It's trying the same thing over and over again, and it like always failing, and like, oh well, maybe the problem is that it's not designed for me, right? And I didn't know how I was going to navigate that, but I knew that thing that I held on to as a kid was going to be my motivating factor behind it. I think that has geared me. I don't like professionalism in that in the typical sense. I like things keep things very casual, um, you know, and real and intimate, right? And when I meet with folks, I think kind of going back to what I said before, that firsthand lived experience, a lot of people seek that out. And I'm surprised at how many people are seeking that out right now, because I think they too are fed up with being spoon fed this pathologizing, like like dehumanizing medical approach of everything. And they want to go back to the source. And I'm really happy for that I can be one of the people who are providing that. Um, I I think I having no expectations of like the people I meet with too is a big factor of it. I think a lot of people when they meet with like a consultant or a counselor or anybody who's doing similar work I'm doing have this idea that they need to like arrive on time, they need to dress a certain way, they need to like be completely I have clients who like meet me in their pajamas, like smoking a cigarette outside while playing video games because it helps them focus and kind of articulate what they're trying to do while they're not focused by something. I'm an autistic person. I want other people to be allowed to be autistic when they're meeting with me. I think when people are looking for education on autism, they find an autistic person. And I think there's a lot of people doing similar work that I'm doing, but I think what sets me apart is that I allow that space to be it's punk rock. I allow people to be as absolutely authentically themselves without any judgment. Not because it's like a standard that I have. It's because I don't. I would want to be that. I would want to be on the receiving end of that. I want to be comfortable. I don't want those expectations placed on me. So it would only be fair if I don't do it for other people.
If there's someone out there that's listened to this interview that that's thinking, okay, like I'm really inspired, or they're already inspired and they just love this podcast and love you, and they're thinking, I want to create my own project, my own business, go my own way, like not necessarily adhere to a system that's not working for me, for jobs that I can't get, or when I do get, don't feel good. That's a challenge because, I mean, as we talked about different models of society, and we're operating within like a capitalist structure, and we need money to survive, and we need to use the tools, I think, that are at our disposal at this point to kind of effectively realize, even to have a societal shift, you kind of need to use the tools currently available to get that message, I guess, across. Like, how have you approached starting a business? Because the prior work you've done has been like amazing start and kind of education, I think, to get to this point in understanding like what you want to do and gaining experience. But it's not necessarily experience, I guess, in running a business and managing these different like elements. So how have you kind of like found your way to learn that and kind of get to where you've got now?
It was kind of like an organic process of just like I started a Facebook page. Year later, it built up. There was a couple of posts and things I wrote that got really popular. I started connecting with other people who are doing similar things in my community, the disability and queer network sort of stuff on social media, engaging with each other. And but while kind of, I don't know, there's a lot of like collectivism in like the neurodiversity like social like networking community, and there's a little bit of it me kind of I'm a couple steps outside of the circle. Like I engage with it, but I'm not like always a part of it because I don't like falling into like an in group completely, because I still want to be open to criticism. I still want to be open to like things that need to be addressed and changed. And I sometimes feel that when people are so engaged in like one, it becomes like groupthink. And it also becomes really difficult for people inside of those groups to like engage with like their own constructive criticism that they need for themselves for change. When it comes to like the business side of it, I don't have any experience in like running a business. I didn't go to business school. I have a degree in psych, right? Like I I see patterns and things, but like for me, it was kind of like, oh, I started a Facebook page. Oh, the Facebook page is growing. Huh. I don't like my job. I'm having a really hard time working. It's crushing and ruining me. why don't I try to do case management, but like on my own without like having a manager working for an organization?
Yeah. We've, as I said, we've had this for a long time, but like one of the reasons that made me even more interested in doing it is that someone wrote on one of the videos, can you do one on entrepreneurship? And I'm curious, like thinking about um, money, like if there's someone interested in starting something themselves and money is a concern, like when you left your job and like how do you kind of think about, well, you weren't at the stage that you are now 3 years ago, you had the Facebook group was growing, but you just left the job. How do you like overcome both the fear potentially of like being able to survive economically, but also potentially the fear, like you seem to have quite a strong sense of like, this will work, I know who I want to help, and use modeling yourself as like giving people what you felt you needed. I'd empathize with that thought process, but until you see it working, or you actually recognize, okay, there are people that need these services, what I have to offer, that doubt can come in. So how do you overcome both the doubt, to think of the economic sense, and also of art is what I think people might need real?
I'll be completely transparent. I'm privileged because I don't live alone. I live with my partner, and my partner does. We live in one of the most expensive areas in the United States, right? We live in Denver, and I mean, we're not well off by any means, but we also don't have to worry like if we're not going to be able to eat, right? And I would not be able to do anything that I do without the support of my family. Um, I think that if I were in a position where I was living alone, I've struggled below the poverty line most of my adult life, right? Like I've been homeless before. Like I've gone through some hardship, and I'm at a point now where I'm able to get the support that I need. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, making money, I know that like if I were in a position where like I want I needed to quickly like replace my income of quitting my job in order to make ends meet. I don't I don't think that I'm the type of person who would be able to be entrepreneurship minded fast enough to make that happen. I would probably have to do this alongside while working full time. Um, Otherwise, I don't think it would work out. I think that also being on like disability support services has helped because it gives me supplemental income. That's helped a lot. But then there's the other side of it where I like also have to limit my income. So I think when it came to quitting my job, it's such a weird paradox. It doesn't make any sense. Like you have to be poor in order to like make like these support services, but if you make too much, you can't have it anymore. It doesn't make any sense. It just be universal for everybody. But when I was working, I was in a position where like there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anxiety of like, what am I going to do? Like if I take this approach and I take a different trajectory, I knew that like with my own limitations of being disabled and chronically ill, chronically in pain, it was going to take me a lot longer than it would for somebody else. And that if I were going to make it successful and I was going to be healthy and happy, I would have to work at my own pace. Granted, I do have some support, which gives me some privilege to be able to take that time to do that. But there's also like, I think when I was working full time, I was at a point where I I don't want to create the illusion that I had like some like established career. Jobs have never been very stable for me. I think the longest job I've ever held was a year, and on average, it was about 4 to 6 months before I either got burned out, sunk into like horrible anxiety, depression, and was not able to mask anymore and would quit, or I'd get fired. I was always jumping from one thing to the other, which is great because it's built a lot of experience, but also it's like it's not very stable, right? Um, and it was getting to that point again. I loved what I did. I just hated the lack of accommodations and me like being in a place where it just like fundamentally was not. I wasn't able to navigate that space anymore because it was destroying me. And I think the decision I had was that I either risk it, risk like falling into like a position where like I have to find supplemental income, or continue down this path and have it be worse than what the risk was. And it was kind of like a leap of faith. And I think taking it was one of the best things I've ever done. But I also recognize that like where I want to be with like, I want to consider myself an entrepreneur by any means. Like I think that kind of implies that like somebody has like this like idea of how to navigate like a business and like have like profit be like what's the next step to make more money. And for me, it's like, what's the next step to be more accessible and develop something more concrete and stable. I can worry about the money side when I get to it, right? But I also have to like, I can't make too much money or I like lose my benefits. And so it's this really weird kind of rocky ground. I think the part that is, I guess, slightly more entrepreneur wise is that I've taken some time to kind of look at like my local community. And when I've worked in nonprofits and other stuff in the community, my thought was nonprofits shouldn't have to exist, right? It's a band-aid on a symptom of a problem rather than like the problem being addressed from causation, right? Tremendous support services are phenomenal, right? They do great stuff, but there's also like some problems underlying the systematic reason why they exist. And for me, one of the problems that I recognized was the lack of accessibility to neurodivergent disabled people. And in my area, a lot of these like local support service nonprofits all kind of communicate with each other. And my biggest problem of why I left was because there was lack of accessibility, lack of accommodations. And when I switched from like the Punk Rock Autistic to neurodiversity unbound, I felt that like that would market a little bit better rather than like going into like this persona of like the Punk Rock Autistic that's a great social media name. That's a great like pseudonym for like a book or something. Kind of a lousy thing to sell yourself on as a business, right? And so I needed to have like an alternative, and that actually worked out pretty well. And then I've been creating little infographics about like what I do, and then I've reached out to like the d.e.i.s or like HR representatives or whatever from like other local nonprofits. It's like, hey, I know you guys are trying to like become more inclusive. Like, do you want to hire like an autistic disabled person to do this? Here's my skills, what I do, what I offer. And a couple of them reached out, and it's worked out really well. This is all still like a very much like a growing process.
I think what you're offering there is like being open to being proactive in a way, like taking a risk or not a risk, but a soft risk in terms of like, hey, I'm looking to reach out to someone. I'm looking to do this thing, see how maybe it aligns with something they're looking to do, and just be open to kind of like thinking about different ways that you might be able to create the kind of working life that you want. And I think that's the challenge, right? When you're kind of, we're stuck in this kind of, as I called it before, like contemporary conventional way of working where there's a company and you go there, slightly different from a kind of conventional freelancer. I think what you're doing, and maybe to an extent what I'm trying to do, which is really kind of design your working life and what you're doing, and I think that involves like using a bit of like the creativity that we have in terms of like how we go about that.
I think I understand how to answer this in the best way. Is that my philosophy behind this is more than just like my work. It's also like kind of transcendent into like every aspect of my life, and especially like my environment. Is that I'm tired of working for my environment. I'm making my environment work for me. And that goes to like my house, my home, myself, my like everything, right? And my work especially, is that I had this idea of like how things are supposed to operate, the order of operations, how the beginning and the end looks. And I'm forcing myself to go down a path that isn't designed for me. So I'm trying to create one that I work with in a much more healthy way. And I think my original point, I think, is I think a big part of this is actually really is inspired from like that DIY punk rock ethos, is that it's similar to like not wanting to like ever sign to a corporate label, is let's just do it ourselves. We don't like, being 16 and being in a band and me selling like cassette tapes for $1.50 in a parking lot that our band recorded on an 8-track like in the basement of my dad's house is like, it's kind of the same thing, right? And like not knowing how to do any sort of like editing or designing, so we figured it out as we went along, and I, it's kind of I enjoy that more because I think I've failed a lot in life, and I will continue to do so. And I used to be so resistant towards that failure that it was the definition of failure that was the problem. And now it's more of like a learning experience. Like if I screw up, that's good. That means that I can adjust and become better, right?
I wrote down resilience, and I was thinking like in terms of the way you were talking about kind of like trying things, whether there was a part of kind of deciding that one needs to get okay with like trying and it doesn't work, and you accept to like, well, I try. It's not a backward step necessarily. It's like, well, now I have more knowledge in a way that maybe that didn't work that way, and kind of reframing like loads of stuff in one's mind, I think can be so powerful. And that kind of links, I guess, into the question of did you have doubts about what you're doing beyond the kind of economics of it, of like, you think you want to do this, but like until you've done it and you've seen that success, like how does one maintain that kind of trust?
I think everybody has doubts, and I think that if you don't have any doubts, you're probably doing something wrong. I think that like we need to have that ability to like question what we're doing, right? And like I don't do well with like complacency. I don't do well with like being comfortable because like I've never really been comfortable. Because I like everything makes me anxious, right? So for me, like I think that like to say that like I haven't had doubts would be like ridiculous. Like I have doubts every single day about what I do. Like a lot of it actually comes from like I go through a lot of like cyclical thinking about like I'm a burden on others because I'm not able to always support myself financially, medically. Like there's a lot of pressure on my partner to like maintain like the way that she's going about life because like I probably wouldn't be able to make it on my own, right? Like like that creates a lot of internalized thoughts, a lot of internalized ableism, and it makes me think like, hey, should I just quit all this and go back to working and just like bite the bullet, destroy myself in the process, just so that I can be less of a strain on other people? And then I talk to them about it, and I get reassured that I made the right choice, and that helps a lot. And I think it also gives me a sense of like reminding me of the purpose of what I'm doing and like why it's important.
Maybe what's in that is like trusting in oneself, and like so if for example like you believe are people that are out there that you feel one could help, even if you haven't seen the evidence, like just retain belief in that, even if in the immediate that like it's not kind of like you're not seeing the results, it's not in terms of monetarily or audience or whoever you're trying to reach, just like believe in that, kind of hold that belief.
It requires a sense of like faith, right? Faith in yourself, faith in your own drive and your own potential, and the impact that you can make. I think that there are definitely some people who may not possess that, and I struggle endlessly with self-doubt and self-criticism and self-worth. Like I still need a lot of help with that. I get a lot of, I'm in therapy and treatment for stuff like that, like when it comes to like my own self-image. But there is this like natural sense of like I don't have an alternative. If this doesn't work, it doesn't matter if it's this or if it's anything else. It's like I at least have to try, because I want to do this. I love doing this. It's the same thing about like how I feel with music. Like I don't play music because I want to make money. I play because I have to. I have to get it out. I have to write. I have to play music. I have to work with other people in my community because they need help. And it's not really a choice, but knowing that like I might not see an immediate effect right now, but I will eventually. And I have. And that when it does come back around, that makes everything worth it,
I guess what's interesting for me for you is, even though the experiences themselves haven't necessarily been always the most gratifying, and the work that you've been doing has been kind of something that you've been interested in, not all of it maybe, but a lot of it, and led to where you are now. So how do you think you found that kind of like actually supporting people in these different ways, in these different jobs, be it a social worker, be it the varying ways that you've worked with people with disability? How did you recognize this is something that I'm good at or I want to do?
A lot of trial and error, I think, was a big factor in it. Dissatisfaction, not feeling. I wasn't. I think a big part of it is that like I philosophically can't engage in something if I don't feel like I'm getting fulfilled with it. I can't ignore it. My first couple of jobs were like in retail, and I I I wasn't there because I liked my job. I was there because I needed a job, and that was it. And that's all it was to me, was a job. And this whole idea that like, you know, you see this a lot, I think, more talked about is like, especially with like the younger generation being a lot more radicalized to like the BS that comes with work, right? Of like, I'm not going to be exploited. I'm not going to stay past my job. And they're like, oh, well, you need to work harder to show that you love this job. It's like, no, I'm here to pay the bills and that's it. I have no loyalty to you as a manager, to this organization. And I think there's always a very strong anti-capitalist, anti-materialist kind of idea within me, even when I was younger. But that caused a lot of pressure because I also wasn't given the accommodations to need to thrive. I wasn't able to like socially adapt to the standards that were needed for a proper job. That I got fired a lot, and it got to the point where I think I got so sick of like of juggling that constant cycle. I remembered when I was in high school, I got placed into like this like education format that was like an alternative type of education. It was designed and catered specifically for, I think, what they call probably like what is it, gifted and learning now, like gifted and learning disabilities. And willing to bet that most of the people that were in those rooms were autistic, but they were also like high risk of becoming like troublemakers, right? Because they were bored, unsatisfied, like not getting their needs met. They often weren't challenged, so they would act up in class. And I was in those sorts of rooms with people, but it was designed perfectly to be kinesthetic. And I remember thriving. I did really, really well in those because it was much more hands-on education rather than regurgitation. It was actually learning. And instead of having like one teacher, and then like a couple of aides, they had people who were like you and I, who were like the like pairs in the class, and like they'd hang out with like the students, and they were like respected them as peers and equals. And I had one teacher in particular that I remember really fondly, who he himself was totally open about like his own struggles and being neurodivergent. And this was like in the early 2000s, so it was really unheard of at the time. And he was super punk rock. He had sleeves and huge gauges, and he would go on walks with like students sometimes after school and like smoke cigarettes with them and just like be real, right? And like, because all of us like smoked and like drank and stuff, right? Like, because we were having escapism issues. And granted, I never fell really past that than like an occasional beer, but like the other kids weren't so fortunate with their own with addiction issues, right? But like it created this sense of like authenticity and vulnerability. And he always encouraged me to like to fuck up when you need to, right? So you can learn from it. And I think when I like started working, I remembered him, and like in the work that he did, and like how he was on the level of other people. And then outside of school, he also worked like in group homes and stuff. And I was really struggling in one particular class. Instead of going to that class, they actually suggested that I take up a volunteer like IDD position of like a student para. So I started doing that, and it was a classroom for like the more high support needs with like people with intellectual developmental disabilities, that form of special ed. And I started going to that classroom, and I had a one-on-one. This guy with Down syndrome, and we hung out every single day. And I 10 years later when I was working, I remembered that I was like, I love that. That felt great. Like that was such an easy, natural, organic thing for me.
Why do you think you didn't go from that feeling then 10 years ago to like, instead of retail, I'm going to like look at what jobs are available doing that type of work?
I didn't know it was an option. I also lived in an area where there wasn't a lot of options, and I moved, and it was like everywhere. Um, and I found it because I was working at the mall in my area at the time, and I there was a group of guys who like would do community outings with like their one-on-ones. And I just went up to the guy. I was like, where do you work? Like, is this like a job? Is this like a thing that you do? And he's like, oh yeah, man, I'm a DSP. I work for so and so. And I'm like, can I have their number? And I applied for it, and I got the job. And that's kind of when I got back into that field when I was like 22, 23. And then I never went back to retail after that. So, yeah. And then I did that for 12 years.
My interpretation of this answer is what helped is really actually giving some conscious thought to what was the type of work that I have felt has been gratifying. What have I actually enjoyed? And what created the opportunity is kind of like doing that, having that recognition, that realization, and then like being proactive, I guess, about like reaching out. Okay, hey, I want to get in touch with such and such, and kind of trying to make that happen. Just to speak to my own experience, I feel like it's taken me so long to get to a place where it's like, hey, I can decide what I do with my time. I don't just need to kind of look at what is available, where can I kind of contort what I can do into what someone else wants. It's okay for me to design, and potentially everyone to an extent, to design their own life. And that thinking, I think, is necessary though, of like, but what do I like to do? Where do I feel my strengths are, and what gives me pleasure?
I think that's where it all starts, is at asking yourself that. And this is something I encourage like friends of mine or clients of mine, is they're like, oh, I hate my job. And my first like kind of encouragement investigation is, do you hate your job? Why? And what is it about that is causing you anxiety at work? And if you can recognize those things, does it matter what job you do? Are you still going to feel that way? Right? Is it the actual job, or is it the context of how you are working that is the problem? And a lot of people, I think it's like that. They can't separate work and life, and they can't find that. But then there's this inherent core thing that what you're doing probably isn't designed for the person of who you are. What is it that you enjoy, and what is it that you can handle? Where are your limitations? Everybody has bandwidth, right? And like, how much bandwidth like can you expend at work and still live like a meaningful life outside of it? Like, I don't think that your job should be your identity. If you, like, it should be something that you can either do to make ends meet and be okay with it, and then find like life outside of that, or is it something that you can that works for you and can be a benefit to your life, and can be something that you find meaning and fulfillment in? I think the problem is that like a lot of people like don't think that exists for them, and I think it does for everybody. I just think it's like how like what like you got to think about it. It could be a little unorthodox. It could be something you least expect. You know, there's almost like a very like kind of Buddhist kind of like thought to it, right? Is that like, are you placing your idea of self and identity into like what you're doing, or is it placing it in you? And I think finding like almost like a sense of like not unattachment, but non-attachment to it, it can be really beneficial, and not only in like finding freedom from like the burden of work, but also like finding work that frees you from the burden of life, right? Like of finding that like natural kind of like enjoyment in it. It's but it requires some self-reflection, I think, and risk.
100%. Let's make this the last question. Are there ways you feel society and employers can better support neurodivergent individuals in respect to work? I mean, that's a big question, but and we've touched on like a lot of the nuanced aspects, I think. But I wonder, like, when you speak to people that maybe don't have as much grounding as you and I, like, what do you say to people that like are coming at this from either not a place of lived experience or just kind of new to it as kind of key aspects?
I wrote about this like actually a couple months ago, and my article is actually on the Punk Rock Autistic, and I wrote specifically about this topic. Is that like neurodiversity in the workplace needs to include neurodiverse people first and foremost. The power needs to be given to them and them alone. If you want to create an environment that is providing change in education that is more accommodating for disabled people, hire disabled people to create that change. Give them the authority, give them the power. And it's I think that is the most important like first step towards it. It's hire. It's not even like a self plug. It's like an honest like thought. Like it hire it, like don't hire the agency that's local that has like the backing of millions of dollars of donors, that puts neurodiversity on their label. Find a place that's owned by like the little people who like actually like are disabled and have that lived experience. They'll provide you with so much more resources, so much more education and passion, because they're not only advocating for people like them, like who are like them, they're advocating for themselves. I've seen some great change with like organizations that are, even if it costs them profit, they recognize that like the well-being of the people that work for them is more important. Like there's a couple agencies I've seen that have removed the hour, like allow disabled people to make their own schedule of when they're available to work, and actually like following that, and then creating and like allowing them to adapt their own environment to suit their needs. That is really powerful. And I think having access to wellness resources for all employers, regardless if it's like designed specifically for neurodivergent people, because a lot of people might not be open about like where they're at in life. I think having access to counselors and therapists and wellness support, offering wellness hours to employers, to employees, to like have a couple hours a week where they can still get paid, but they can go and like encouraged to go do something that's like good for them. A sustainable environment that's inclusive, like and like rather than like, oh, we're gonna have a pizza party, pay people more money, get like have access to like good to good resources to advance their career. It's more, the answer is hard to give because it's so much more than just like hiring somebody to do a workshop. It's like you need to like fundamentally change how you work and how you have other people work for you. Luckily, there's people who exist who specialize in that, right? I could also go the roads like join a union. Unionization is really powerful, and I think there's disability unions that exist out there. There's a lot of different factors, but I think those are intention and actually really like doing the work and knowing that you might have to take a risk as an employer. Because the people who work for you are human beings, and if you want to create a sustainable environment, you need to remember that.
Thanks so much, Dani. I really appreciate you taking this time, a lot of time.
Well, this has been a huge honor, and I'm glad that you found me and wanted to include me into this avenue today. So yeah, thanks for having me around. I really enjoyed these couple of hours together.